Good afternoon. We are going to get going. I'm Janie Cohen. I'm director of the Fleming, and we are thrilled to have Judith Bookbinder with us today. She is the curator of the co-curator of the exhibition and author of the fabulous catalog that comes with the show. She's speaking on the special artists of the Civil War. And I hope you've all had a chance to look around a little bit. If not, please stay afterwards and take a look. It's a phenomenal collection. So Judith she's part-time art history faculty member at Boston College. She has curated exhibitions, aside from this one, a number of exhibitions on aspects of American and European art at various venues in the Boston area. Published broadly on various topics in 19th and 20th century art. And in addition to editing and writing about the artistic aspect of these drawings in the catalog, she has also written an essay entitled First-Hand Drawings and Printed Engravings that is going to be published shortly in America's War, talking about the Civil War and emancipation on the 150th anniversaries. So I really look forward to hearing the story of this collection, which is just phenomenal. And we thank you for doing the show. It's just really terrific. So please join me in thanking and welcoming Judith Bookbinder.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the Fleming Art Museum and the University of Vermont for inviting the exhibition here and doing such a wonderful job of installing it and pairing it with relevant exhibitions of artifacts, and the Kara Walker prints are wonderful and certainly bring the whole discussion of Civil War imagery and the experiences of African Americans and such from that time up to the present day, and that is even relevant to these drawings, although they were done obviously in the 1860s by people very much steeped in that situation. There's a kind of universality, I think, of human experience that I find in these drawings that makes them alive today as much as they may have been at the time of their creation. So I do feel that they resonate for viewers today as much as they inspired readers of newspapers looking, thirsting, hungering for accounts of contemporary events in the 1860s. The story of this particular collection, the Becker collection, is a really amazing one. So I'll just quickly kind of run that by you before we get into the discussion of the people who were called special artists in particular, who worked, in the case of this collection, for one of the first of the three earliest illustrated newspapers in the United States, as Frank Leslie's Illustrated News. The collection is named the Becker Collection for a man named Joseph Becker, who was one of the special artists who, in fact, participated, accompanied as an embedded observer and reporter with the U.S. Army during the later half of the Civil War. He was part of that process, and as you walk around, you'll see drawings by Joseph Becker. What happened to him, to jump ahead a little bit, in the post-war period is ultimately he went back to work for Frank Leslie's after the war. He was a reporter for Leslie's, an artist reporter, covering many important events in the post-war period, and ultimately about 1875 he took over the position of director of the art department of Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper. And he remained in that position until 1900 when he retired. Apparently, although there's no documentation of this, but we can only infer, when he retired, he took drawings with him that he had collected. We don't know why he chose certain drawings and not others. Some of them, several hundred, were his drawings. The other several hundred were by other artists who had worked for Leslie's at different times. And so he took approximately 700 drawings with him that nobody wanted. When we talk about how the newspaper was produced, you'll understand why. They were just considered the, you might call the source material for illustrations which the newspaper either chose to publish or didn't. And so he took those drawings with him. When he passed away, his wife had those drawings somewhere in the house, I assume, in Brooklyn, where they lived. And when she passed away, those drawings were inherited. They were just Dad's drawings. They were inherited by Mrs. Becker's daughter. And subsequent generations, for about 4 generations, those drawings were passed down to the eldest daughter in the family. Sheila Gallagher, my partner on this project, co-director of the Becker collection, herself an artist and professor in the studio program at Boston College, is the next of succession in that line of Joseph Becker's direct heirs. As a child, she recalls that she and her sister played with Grandpa Joe's drawings. It's a miracle that they didn't take crayon and magic marker to fill in Grandpa Joe's drawings. They didn't. No one knows why. She doesn't know why she did not do this. There's no clear idea. Nobody else seemed to value these drawings, except that they had kind of personal family value. Why a cup of coffee wasn't poured over them or a bottle of ink? No explanation for this. The drawings survived, and Professor Gallagher stored them under her son Jude's bed when he was a baby, under his crib. But by that point, she had become both a painter and an art historian, and she began to think about those drawings and realized that there was something more to these drawings, though she wasn't sure exactly what. When she came to Boston College, she approached me because my field is American art, showed me the drawings, and I wasn't sure of their value as historical documents because I had never studied them. But what I was sure of from the moment I saw the first of them was that these were, some of them at least, beautiful drawings by any standard that you might use. Beautiful drawings done under whatever conditions, not to mention the conditions under which these particular drawings were done. And so we began to investigate them. And it turned out that not only did we know that there were close to 700 drawings in this collection, but that this was by far the largest and up to that point totally unknown collection of Civil War drawings in the United States, and that the only larger collection of drawings was in the Library of Congress in the entire country, and that there were a few others scattered around the country, more or less documented or not. So this is an amazing collection, the bottom line is, and I am thrilled to have been part of the process of bringing them to light so that the public can enjoy them in this exhibition. We have published all the drawings that are on display are published in color prints in the catalog for the exhibition, so there'll be a continuing record. And we have a website which perhaps you are aware of, where you can research not only these drawings, but the other 570 or so in the collection, one by one, if you're interested, looking at the documentation, that is the information inscribed on the drawings themselves, and the identification of those drawings. So if you just Google Becker Collection Civil War, our website comes up. Have fun, and if you're at all interested, and it's been wonderful that over the years since the website went online, which was in 2008, 2009, during that period, thousands of people have visited it. So it's turned out to be an amazing source of inspiration and research material for scholars across the world. And we hear from them, that's how we know. And so you're more than invited to take advantage of these resources, and that's sort of the background on the Becker collection. The Becker collection, as I said, stems from a new process that Frank Leslie put in play beginning in the 1850s, actually. In the 1850s, a total of three, Frank Leslie's was the first of three illustrated newspapers that were established in the United States. It's hard for us to imagine newspapers without images. We take them so for granted. Of course, most, in the modern sense, they're photographic images, but nonetheless, images seem so totally intertwined with the reporting of news that it's hard to imagine a time when that wasn't so. But in fact, up through the 1850s, that was the case. Sometimes little drawings, more as advertisements and such, would be included with stories in what passed for newspapers prior to that point. But the reporting of contemporary events and the illustrating of those contemporary events does not happen before the 1850s. The other two newspapers, by the way, are Harper's Illustrated and New York Illustrated, and those three were established at that time. Frank Leslie did something, though, that catapulted the Frank Leslie's Illustrated to the top ranks, particularly during the Civil War, in terms of distribution and timeliness, particularly timeliness, is that he figured out a system up till through the 1850s and just about 1860. The method that was used to take a drawing made on the scene in conjunction with a specific event and turning that drawing into a printable image in a newspaper required an artist back in New York City to take a drawing wherever it came from, do by hand a wood engraving, either copying or tracing that original drawing, modifying it, however Frank Leslie chose to modify it, and then making a tin or a steel plate from that wood engraving. That steel plate could then be inked and run through a printing press just as the text of the story would be produced. It took roughly 2 weeks' time from the point of receiving a drawing through the 1850s, and as I said, up to about 1860, 61, it took about 2 weeks' time to produce that image. And so stories, of course, were always several weeks behind their actual date of occurrence, because that's the time it took to produce the visual image. What Frank Leslie did is he said, well, what if instead of having one engraver taking a drawing and making carving a wood relief, a wood engraving, and going through that process, what if we took one block of wood, put the drawing on it, cut it into 12 pieces, 12 separate, just sawed it apart after the drawing was done, handed them to 12 engravers, and told them by tomorrow morning, you need to engrave your little chunk, maybe this big. That worked. And what Leslie did after the 12 pieces would come back, he designed a kind of clamp, a frame, It's like imagine it, you know, those children's puzzles that with the big wood pieces, sort of like that, but with a metal frame to hold those 12 pieces together. Then the steel plate could be electroplated first and then shaped out of that single reunited piece of wood, and the process went on. It reduced the turnaround time from 2 weeks or more to 24 to 36 hours. And this was a remarkable development. It meant that stories about events, battles, or whatever that occurred from 1861 forward could be in the newspapers and reported within 2, maybe 3 days of their occurrence. Now, that doesn't sound like much, that sounds like a long time to us, but at the time it was remarkable. So Frank Leslie was responsible for this new technology and processing that made it possible to bring people stories of the war as it was occurring. And that was very important to people who had sons and husbands and brothers and fathers on the front lines. People at home wanted to know, of course, what was happening. So on the screen you see the front page of a Frank Leslie's from the early days of the war, and it gives you a sense of the immediacy that these drawings presented to the people who read the newspaper, and it catapulted Frank Leslie's circulation to between 200,000 and 400,000 copies per week, which is an enormous circulation at the time. Now, I want to bring your attention to also the fact that the reporters who are called special artists, who made these drawings, who experienced various events, were not only human beings, a fact that is lost sometimes in our thinking about the illustrations in the newspaper. The illustrations in the newspaper often seem as though they appear out of nowhere, as though they were just done by machine. And ultimately, the engravings that were produced were mechanical looking. So the humanity of the reporters, of the special artists, is often lost, but the special artists were unique individuals, and one of our goals in the creation of this collection, the presentation of it on the website, but most important, the presentation in the exhibition, is to make the reality of these artists come alive as you see the exhibition, that these were individual personalities responding to often horrific things that they witnessed, and bringing their personal experiences to bear on the drawings they made. In the process of turning those drawings, as I described the process to you, into images that appear in the newspaper, a lot of their individuality was purposely washed out of the image. Frank Leslie wanted the drawings to take on a uniformity, a kind of visual projection of his own personality. Also, because of the way I described, they were turned into engravings, where each chunk of an image was done by a separate artist, perhaps 12 different engravers. He set very rigid standards for exactly how a shadow is created, how many lines you used, how close together those lines would be placed, so that there would be uniformity throughout the image. You could see why that would make sense. In the process, though, the individuality of the artist was lost. And so I want us to go back to the artist's experience. And the first thing, by putting these two drawings together, the first thing I want us to notice, by the way, these two drawings, the ones you're looking at now, were done by probably the most technically gifted of all the artists, the special artists. Oh, by the way, the term special artist was one that that Frank Leslie and the editors of Harper's and New York Illustrated used regularly to refer to their artist reporters. They were called special artists, capital S, capital A, and that's the term that was used for them. So Henry Lovey was probably, certainly on the Leslie staff, one of the most, if not the most, manually talented and visually acute of the artists who did drawings certainly during the early years of the war. And he did a series of drawings, as you can see them there, after he had covered the war for some time, basically setting out the sufferings and the tribulations from a personal perspective of the special artist. So I think you'll all hear me if I walk away from the mic. You can all hear me. So we can see him, he represents himself in this book of drawings. There's a series of about 5 drawings that were actually used in the newspaper for an article called Adventures of a Special Artist. That was the title that was used. And we see him at the beginning and the end of his adventures, the way Lovey describes them. And so we see here, in the one on the left, we see the special artist. Here he is. And he looks, to my mind, it reminds me of Don Quixote. You know, he's trudging through. The reason this is all blank is this is supposed to be snow. And on the drawing, he writes, snow, 28 inches snow. So he's trudging. He's gotten off this riverboat, which has delivered him and his assistant, who's carrying all his equipment. If this isn't Sancho Panza, I don't know. So we have, kind of this Quixote-like special artist and his sidekick carrying the baggage, dragging themselves, but very vehemently through the snow. They're on the way, and they're going to draw to record some event that they're out to look for. Whether if it's snow and it's wintertime, it's not about, because battles occur in wintertime. So it may be camp life at a particular encampment, and that's what we see here. So we have this sense of him starting out with great determination. Now at the end, it's several weeks later, and now we see here's the same Don Quixote-like figure, only he is, he's here. He needs to be assisted down the gangplank back to the riverboat. He's so broken by his sufferings during his period out in the snow. And once again, the drawing says on it, snow, 28 inches snow. And so it's a big deal. And behind him, again, comes Sancho Panza schlepping the drawing equipment, and they are struggling to get down the gangplank, not to mention doing anything else. What this points out is before we even consider the messages in the drawings or anything else, we need to realize the physical circumstances under which these artists worked. While this is not an exaggeration, basically, but it's here is Lovey's take on his own struggles. These struggles were very real, and they're there in accounts not only of Henry Lovey's accounts, but other artists talking about the terrible tribulations under which they functioned, even when bullets weren't whizzing by their heads. They had to endure the same hardships that the soldiers endured, which were very severe, even in times when fighting wasn't occurring. So we can see the real suffering that was involved and the human effort involved in making the drawings that you see all around you. I've made the point that Lovey's drawings were made in, those 2 drawings were made during the winter time when battles don't occur. But of course, the greatest interest that readers back home had was in what did happen in battle. And artists made different choices, even in terms of how the battle experience would be rendered or how they would experience the battle themselves. I mean, you can imagine these artists, if they went close to a battle, were targets as much as anyone else. Anyone else would be a target for either side, and so would the artist. So to go close to the battle, to put yourself in a position, as Frank Schell did here, to capture this skirmish of the Texas Rangers, it was a very risky thing to do. Some of the artists, like Frank Schell, the artist who made this drawing, chose to do that. And so we see here that he and we are located right in the middle of the action. Now, that has good and bad sides. Of course, it puts us right into the experience of a particular group of soldiers and their particular encounter. The downside of that is that this particular group, and we can notice, you know, there might be 20 figures in this drawing, constitutes, of course, a microcosm in what a skirmish would be a small encounter, fairly limited encounter, but there may have been several hundred soldiers in that encounter, not to mention that the major battles involved often tens, if not over 100,000 soldiers at one time. So how does an artist capture the scope of that experience of those big battles if he's right in the middle of the encounter? The truth is, if an artist chooses to be in the middle of the encounter, he will not cover the scope of the battle. That is a choice that he's making. Nonetheless, the immediacy of that encounter here that Frank Schell gives us is very real. This is certainly one of the most spectacular drawings in the collection. It has almost a Baroque quality of composition, of curves and diagonals that carry our eye throughout the image and really give us a sense of the power of the battle itself. But as I said, some of the artists were more inclined to step back and take a long view. This is also a beautiful drawing. Now, this is by an artist named Fred Schell. Both Fred Schell and Frank Schell came from Philadelphia. Frank Schell worked for Leslie's for an extended period of time. In fact, he continued as an artist and was the director of the art department after the Civil War, before Joseph Becker replaced him. So Frank Schell stays with the paper a long time. Fred Schell sort of comes in late in the war as an employee of Leslie's and one of the artists who covered a number of major, particularly sieges. He covers the siege of Vicksburg, for example. There is no documentation to whether these are brothers. Frankly, my gut says they were. I mean, you've got Frank Schell, Fred Schell, they're both from Philadelphia. They're roughly the same age within a couple of years. That's a lot of coincidence. But is it possible? Again, we have no documentation to say that they for certain are brothers. It's hard to imagine that they weren't. But notice that Fred Schell takes a whole different position. He stands way, way back. And because he stands way back, he gives us a sense of the breadth and space of in this case, the aftermath of Sherman's victory at Lookout Mountain. Now, as we look at the drawing, at first, when I first saw this drawing, I thought, oh, it's what a wonderful, calm relief. This is from all the fighting, the images of fighting, and it has almost an Asian quality. It could be a Japanese or Chinese ink drawing, and it's done with ink, and it has that feeling. It certainly suggests that Fred Schell had seen those sorts of drawings and was picking up on that very delicate and airy, open style. And then, though, if you look carefully at the drawing, you will see that there are tiny numbers and letters set into this otherwise very gently sloping landscape. And you can see some little white marks here and there. Well, if you turn the drawing over, lo and behold, there is a key up here. And what is the key to? The encampments, the location of different units of Sherman's army in the aftermath of battle. So this drawing, in fact, has a great deal of factual information about this military engagement that occurred, where the army was camped directly following the battle, what the topography of the battleground was, all amidst this otherwise gently flowing landscape made of ink washes and a little bit of whitewash thrown in for highlights. So we can see a very different approach here to depicting the events of war. Two of the most, to my mind, dramatic and in some ways poetic renderings to come out of the battle scenes are these two, to my mind. Joseph Becker's scenes on the Jerusalem Plank Road and Andrew McCallum's A Night Attack. Now, both of these drawings were done during the same extended, I don't want to call it attack, siege. It's the siege of Petersburg, and that occurs late in the war. Once Petersburg falls, Richmond would be open. Petersburg was a railroad junction. And once Petersburg fell, then it was a straight shot for Richmond. That was the end of the war. So Petersburg is key to the final months of the war, and the siege went on there for almost a year. It was a long, long siege and very painful, with battles erupting from time and again, and great suffering in Petersburg and great suffering by the armies participating in it. As we look at Joseph Becker's drawing, it seems very straightforward. There are some figures in the foreground, sort of around the campfire. The campfire is over here, where the light is. Soldiers are marching. There are some wagons behind them. There are trees, there are blasted trees behind that. But what an amazing story this drawing tells. Here, lit by camplight, by the firelight, we see soldiers marching in formation, and they're marching toward the battle, which is that way. And they're marching in rhythm, like a machine marching forward into battle. The wagons are going the other way. These wagons are ambulances. They are carrying the injured away from the battle. They're moving that way. And notice this one is making such a sharp turn so fast, because there are wounded, bleeding soldiers who need to be treated, that it looks like the wagon is going to fall over entirely. So there's in fact a lot of motion going on here. So the soldiers are marching into battle, and then the wagons are carrying the result of the battle away. And Becker captures that process, that seemingly endless process of new soldiers going into battle and the injured and dead being carried away from battle in this one image. It's really a remarkable drawing, and of course it uses night light and captures that drama of dark and light as part of the experience. Andrew McCallum also uses light to draw the incredible experience of a night attack, when rockets are being fired back and forth across the lines from one side to another. To look at this drawing, it looks like a celebration. It looks like, is this New Year's Eve? Is it the 4th of July? Are we having a big celebration? And in fact, it is the crossfire of battle that we're seeing. But McCallum turns it into this wonderful, almost abstract rendering of curved lines flowing from a central point, almost like a windmill, as the lines reach outward from the center. It's a beautifully designed image. So we have all sorts of different personal reactions to war that each of these artists presents for us. Many people, not at the time of the war, but later on, said that the drawings are not factual because they were interpretations of individuals who were seeing various things and drawing them, whereas photographs were factual. And it's interesting, though, that photographs such as, this is a very famous photograph that was done during the war, done by a team of Timothy O'Sullivan and Alexander Gardner, more or less under the management of Matthew Brady, who is also a very famous photographer, who had an arrangement with the U.S. government to travel with the Union armies, just as the special artists did, and photograph what they could of the war progress. And this photo is a very well-known photo called Harvest of Death, taken on the battlefield at Gettysburg, after the battle was over. And it's a great photo. And it was included in an exhibition that was displayed in Matthew Brady's studios in New York and Washington. It traveled to a couple of other locations as part of a traveling exhibition of photographs that stunned people and were certainly very dramatic. But it was not used as part of a newspaper story on Gettysburg. And the reason is because photography at this point in the 1860s could not capture action. The process of taking a picture was too slow, a photo was too slow. And people needed to be posed, and they needed to be still, and things couldn't move, and it took time to set up the equipment, and it was impossible to take photographs during battles. So in fact, it was the drawings done by artists on the scene that could capture the action of battle, whereas photography had to be content with photographing corpses, which stayed where they were, obviously, because those were photographable. Furthermore, there was no technology at that point. Wasn't invented till close to the turn of the century, to translate a photograph into an image to be printed in a newspaper, except to do exactly the same thing you do with the drawing. That is, hand it to an engraver or a group of engravers to copy and cut, and you're back where you are with doing the same process you would do with the drawing. So there was no advantage in using a photograph. It didn't give you any more information, and certainly in terms of the newspaper, it was the information that counted. And photographs, while powerful, could not really do that in most cases. There was another thing that photographs didn't do that artists could do, and that was to capture little-known events that occurred, because no photographer would bother to set up the expensive equipment, use glass plates to photograph a scene such as this one. But it took an artist's eye and a sensitivity to realize in the case of Joseph Becker in particular, the particular conditions under which, for example, African Americans lived in camps throughout the Union armies. And in this, first of all, what he documents here is the fact that, as most of us know, that when African Americans were permitted to participate as combat troops in the war, they served in separate regiments. They were not integrated in with white soldiers into the army as a whole. So they were in separate regiments. And they had, among other things, the army instituted special kinds of discipline for African American soldiers, which were never used for white soldiers. One of them was to take recalcitrant soldiers or whatever infractions they committed, I have no idea what they are, and stick them up on this pole where they had to sit for some period of time. Obviously, the thought was that this would be both uncomfortable and humiliating and certainly something to be avoided, and maybe some soldiers took it that way. But the hysterical thing about this drawing is, of course, that these soldiers have accommodated themselves to this preposterous situation. So we have them playing cards, sleeping by putting their backs against one another, doing various things to pass the time while they sit up on this pole being disciplined. So it's a wonderful statement about the adaptability and the cleverness of these soldiers to get around even this ridiculous form of punishment that the army has imposed. There are no photographs of this, and it's only through a few of the drawings that we know that this occurred. There's no reference to it in the newspapers, and only Joseph Becker's drawings document the fact, and it's not only in this drawing, there are others that have this particular detail in them as well, that we know that this form of punishment was used. That's the kind of genre or detail of everyday life that that the special artist could also capture if they wanted to. And here we see Frank Schell with a totally different subject matter, but again, responding to the details of everyday life. And so we see everyday life in the army, that is. So we see here that, of course, the Union Army had to carry its food with it. And here we see the slaughtering of some of the herd. You can see here the herd with sharpshooters who are taking down some of the cattle to slaughter them so that the soldiers can have meat to eat. And they had to keep the cattle alive because there was no means of preserving the meat, of refrigerating it, so they had to slaughter the animals as they went along and then use the meat within a short period of time before it would deteriorate. So here's another scene, the kind of scene that there are no photos of because no one would take the time to create a scene of this kind of everyday activity in a photograph. In fact, though, the story of food in the army is an interesting one, and of course it was, I don't know, Napoleon who said, I think, that an army marches on its stomach, that you gotta provide food. If soldiers don't have food, they're not gonna fight. Or if they try, they don't do a good job of it. So getting food is really important. And when the food supplies ran out that the army might carry with it, then the soldiers turned to another method, which, depending on which side you were on, was either called foraging, which is what the Union soldiers called looking for food, and theft, which was what the local farmers called that same activity. And it raised all kinds of moral issues. And so here we see James Taylor, another one of the special artists, making a drawing, and he calls it the Selden Estate Retaliation. It's written down here. Retaliation is written down here. So what's the retaliation? What's going on? We see this local farm, and here are these two soldiers, and they're threatening, about to attack, I think it's a pig, who is kind of cowering in between them, as though they're bringing military justice of retaliation to this pig, when of course what they're really doing is they're foraging or stealing, depending on your side, stealing the food. And we can see here also that the soldiers are up in the barn, they're throwing wheat or grain out of the storage area of the barn. They're taking this food, and there was a whole discussion about it, and that resonated in the North. So here we see the same drawing turned into a print that was, in fact, printed in Leslie's, and we can see that the general outlines of the drawing are there. We can see that clearly this engraving is based on that drawing by James Taylor, but it's different. It's different in that the scene of retaliation, which is occurring here, is now foregrounded by the scene of an enormous hog who looks like he's just being corralled. He's just being gathered, not beaten the way with the violence that James Taylor captured it, but as though this is just a harvesting operation in place. And it brings up the point that when drawings were turned into engravings, very subtle changes were made. And in those changes, the message was often altered. So instead of both the kind of cutting humor or attack quality that James Taylor's drawing conveys, the sense of criticizing or satirizing what the soldiers were doing and raising the moral issue of what constitutes retaliation, here it looks like just an army action that is occurring, that it's reasonable and correct to do. Enough detail has been added, particularly in the foreground, to detract from what's really going on in the background. And it just says, basically, this is a complicated issue, and we need to leave it at that because the soldiers need to get fed. There are many times when we can look at original drawings and see in them a sense of life and immediacy, this being another Henry Lovey drawing of one of the generals who was very active in the Civil War, General Rosecrans. We can see in the bravado and immediacy of the curved lines and the use of light and shade in a very active way in this drawing become kind of passive and complicated, but turned into a very standardized rendering of a figure on a horse in the final engraving. And that again gives us a sense of the changes that occurred when the drawing becomes turned into a print. And we can see that occurring over and over again. Here again in a beautiful, delicate Henry Lovey drawing, which gives us such a sense of space as the darkness of the line is decreased and becomes a very delicate line fading into the surface of the paper itself. That becomes a much harsher rendering, much drier and more linear in the print as it was produced in and printed for the newspaper. So we see that the character and the touch of the artist was often lost in the final printing process. That brings us to, and I want to not go on much longer, it brings us to two examples of incredible drawings that were done by Henry Lovey during the battle, it's called the Battle of, the Northerners call it the Battle of Shiloh or Shiloh Church. Southerners call it the Battle of Pittsburgh Landing. It occurred in the spring of 1862, and it's kind of a watershed battle in the war. It's a watershed battle because up to that point, the North figured this war would be over in no time, that these Southern plantation guys couldn't possibly hold out against the Union Army. On the other hand, the Southerners figured that, the Union's going to give up because they're not going to want to fight us. And both sides figured the war would be over in no time, wouldn't cost many lives, not to mention any money, and that'd be that. Shiloh, particularly for the North, was the wake-up call. It was the moment when not only in a space of 3 days were in the space of one day, over 20,000 casualties occurred on the northern side alone. In 3 days, it's up by 45,000 people were killed or injured. And when we think of that, and I talk to my students, I said, one life is too many. And think how during the years in Iraq, we wrung our hands when we heard that 5 soldiers had been killed on a day in a particular battle. And that's horrible, no question about it. Here we're talking about 25,000 in one day. It's almost unbelievable. So the numbers at Shiloh were the first time that the North realized that this was going to be a long, drawn-out affair. And the images that brought that home were produced and printed in Frank Leslie's Illustrated. There is one of the series of images that Lovey did. He was the only artist present at the Battle of Shiloh. This is the original drawing that was used to create that print. There are interesting differences between the final print and the original drawing. In the final print, Frank Leslie and his engravers have created large areas of very contrasting dark, particularly in the foreground. And that dark is dramatic, but it covers up many of the most horrific details of the battle. The thing that was really amazing about the battle was not just the loss of life, but the fact that the Union ranks were totally broken, that people who weren't killed or injured ran for their lives. There was utter chaos, there were desertions, people running everywhere, including officers. There was total chaos. In the drawing, we have that. We see the battle lines are here, back here. The soldiers are heading this way. They're running from battle. They're running away. And that was the most shocking thing about the Battle of Shiloh, that the Union troops turned tail because the leaders turned tail and they all ran, scattered over one another in different directions. That's what Frank Leslie recorded. When the engraving was made, yes, we see lots of loss of life, but that look of panic on the faces of the soldiers, the sense of chaos of them running in every direction, has been organized, reduced, cast in shadows, you don't see it, and changed the whole image, and yet it was still forceful enough to make people realize that the price for the battle would be the price for the war would be very great. This is another drawing from that same series about Shiloh, and what it points at is perhaps even more personal, more shocking in its detail. When we look at the print, also published in the newspaper, we can see there are people in the foreground. We can see those ambulances back here. There are people kind of reclining. Here's a fellow on the ground. He's looking up at a doctor who seems to be looking at his arm, perhaps bandaging it. And so we see that this is back away from the battle, and that these people look like they're resting in the foreground. They're not resting. What is happening is that amputations are going on. That's what's happening. Here, a man stands, a fellow helps him up, holds him, and he's holding up a stump of an arm. There's blood dripping down. This is as graphic as it gets. And the fellow reclining here, he's not reclining. He's struggling because what this doctor is doing, he's in the process of amputating the arm. That's what Lovey recorded. That's not what you see in the print. It was graphic enough so that people were shocked, but it in no way represented what Lovey had represented, the horror and the suffering that Lovey had depicted in his drawing. When you walk through the exhibition, you'll see these drawings, and you can look for yourself at them. Sometimes artists capture kind of a poetic moment and amid the destruction and chaos. And here we see Charles Bonwell's drawing of a gunboat that has been sunk in Bayou Teche, Louisiana. And the drawing has such a calm and quiet quality to it that it's easy to forget that the purpose of a sinking like this was not just that there had been a battle and the gunboat had been sunk, but rather that this gunboat, in fact, was sunk by, it was obviously it was a Confederate gunboat. It was sunk by the Confederate Navy because gunboats like this were often hard to navigate in the shallow waters, and rather than struggle with them, they sometimes sunk them to prevent Union boats from being able to pass down that waterway. So this is really an obstacle for that purpose in the water. And yet the drawing is so delicate and beautiful that we lose the fact that it had a strategic purpose in its being there in the first place. And it makes me think of a painting by a New England artist, Fitzhenry Lane, called Brace's Rock, which is painted. Brace's Rock is off the coast of Rhode Island, Newport, Rhode Island, I think, and done around the same time. And we can see that here too we see a wrecked boat, which becomes kind of a metaphor, a symbol of the country as a whole, and the fact of the destruction that the United States was experiencing at this time. And so in the wake of that destruction, we can see the hope for peace to come. And the last drawing I wanted you to see is one that is perhaps among the, in many ways, the least descriptive of the drawings, and yet I think has so much expressive power. It's, as you can see, it's called View of Dutch Gap since the Torpedo Experiment. I've been trying to find out exactly what constituted this torpedo experiment, Lord knows. But I don't know why that just happened. Maybe it just didn't want to. Okay, let's do that. Okay, needed to tell me that information. But we do know that Dutch Gap was created to make a passage from the James River to a more inland waterway. And, but it's a sense of total destruction. This bleak landscape, which has nothing growing in it except for the trees over here, which look so thin and straggly, as if even nature is struggling to survive in this horrible blasted landscape. And the trees furthermore look like they're going to slide right out of this drawing any moment as we watch. And so here we see James Taylor in the last period of the war, last months of the war, really capturing that sense of enormous loss. That's all there is just loss. And so we see that these artists have really experienced and internalized the war and present us with their personal commentary and their personal expressions, and leave them for us in these drawings. So I'll finish now, and if anyone has any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Yes.
What's going to happen to these drawings? They're owned by gallery?
They're in private hands. Her intention is that when she can legally dispose of them, she will donate them to a major institution. There are a number that would eagerly have them. They've approached us, so that they will always be accessible to the public. Yes?
Was there any record that the artists objected to the changes that were made?
Absolutely. Many of them write on the back of drawings they're doing, saying, make sure to use these, and these kinds of lines, and don't make my boats look like shoeboxes. One of them said that. So yes, they comment on what has been done in the past, or they give directions on how they want the works to be, the final image to be rendered. Most particularly the artists who who were there for a long period of time. Henry Lovey does that, Frank Schell does that, Joseph Becker occasionally makes a commentary on how his drawings have been used or how they should be used. So yeah, they were very aware of discrepancies between the final image and what they send.
It seems like the people back at the publications were softening them partially for political,
Absolutely.
as well as artistic reasons.
Absolutely.
Did the artists ever show their political leanings in their objections?
Not on the drawings. Now, there may have been other communications. We don't have any record of that. On the drawings, most of the commentary is technical about how something should be rendered, and they sort of stuck with that. The implications, the political message, and that Frank Leslie was clearly adding. He was very gung-ho for the Union at this point, although he didn't start out that way, by the way, but that's another story. He became very pro-Union, and so he edited. There's a lot of editing going on to present the war in the most positive light possible, but making people aware that it's going to be a hell of a struggle at the same time. Yes?
So many questions. First, I want to say thank you, because I think this show is fantastic.
Oh, I'm glad. I'm glad to hear that.
And it's true. I've always felt that engravings, so much is lost in the process.
Exactly.
And the engravings would feel like propaganda in many ways. But the question I have is, is there any documentation on the artists struggling with conditions, and
Absolutely.
Not so much the war itself, but maybe weather or moisture?
Absolutely.
I mean, in the paper.
Absolutely. Henry Lovey writes this on a number of drawings. So does the artist Forbes, whose work we didn't look at in today. So they do comment on the physical conditions. Joseph Becker himself wrote a piece before he retired in 1900, retired from Leslie's. He wrote a piece called The Civil War Artist, or words to that effect, and he writes about the difficult conditions that they worked under. So there are a number of artists who comment. One writes about doing drawings, trying to get out of the rain by sitting in a puddle but under a wagon. As you can imagine, this during a battle, so he's protected both from the rain and from the bullets, and he's drawing sitting under a wagon. So there is very specific commentary about these conditions. Henry Lovey complained of stomach problems he developed during about 1863, and he finally decided to retire. He made some money on cotton futures, this is true, and he retired, went home to St. Louis.
Yeah, it's interesting because when I look at some of the drawings, I can actually see the graphite, other drawings where the graphite is smooth and really is nice on the tooth of the paper, and then in other instances, you can see the artist really digging in.
Absolutely.
Just that the paper is moist.
That's absolutely right. Sheila wrote about the process of Sheila Gallagher wrote an essay in the catalog about the process, the drawing process itself, and she talks about these conditions. Yes?
There is so much information in these drawings, and I am wondering whether any new information about the lives of the soldiers, or any other aspect of the war has come to light.
Absolutely, absolutely, and we are almost every day. We get, the reason I know this is we get requests from scholars who are working on various aspects of the war, studying one point or another, who need our drawings because they want to use them in their work. So that's, and there have been so many books and articles published already in the last couple of years, or about to be published, that use the information in the Becker drawings. And that raises, by the way, another point, which I chose not to focus on today. mostly when people look at these drawings, they think information, because that's what the engravings were about. The engravings were to give information. Granted, it was doctored, it was edited, but they gave information, as news stories always do. They're supposed to give information to the reader, the viewer. That's their purpose. And so when we look at these drawings, the first reaction is, oh my God, this treasure of information, and that's true. What I've tried to do is make sure that we don't forget that these are works of art, and that we also need to enjoy them, appreciate them, study them from an aesthetic perspective, and that perspective was totally lost in their original viewing. So, but nonetheless, they have been a source of enormous additional information for scholars. Yeah.
And just to the other point about the artistic value of them, one of the things that struck me is the many different ways that battle is described and depicted, whether it's ink blots or erasing the graphites.
You get the sense of puffs of smoke.
Really
Absolutely, right down to those sorts of rendering issues, and different artists take very different approaches, exactly, as they do from the perspective of perspective, from the point of view where the close-up, far away and detached, and how that affects how we understand the battle that occurred. Anybody else? Well, thank you so much, and it was my pleasure to come here today.